Um, Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Alexandria Center for Hellenistic Studies and Institute for Mediterranean Studies Neoplatonic Lectures. Our speaker today is Professor Dominic O'Meara, whom I shall have the honor to introduce, although he does not need any introduction. We all know him and his work, but let me say a few words before giving him the floor. So Dominic O'Meara is Professor Emeritus of Philosophy at the University of Fribourg in Switzerland. He has studied in Cambridge and in Paris with Pierre Hadot. He specializes, as we know, in the Platonic tradition from antiquity to the medieval period, including Byzantine Platonism and more especially Mikhail Psellos, and with a special focus in political philosophy. And he is also a specialist of the Pythagorean tradition, especially in late antiquity when Pythagoreanism is entangled with Platonism. His publications include many books, articles, book chapters, translations. He is the Teubner editor of Mikhail Psellos' Philosophica Minora, Volume 2, published in Leipzig in 1989, I think. And he has dedicated a number of studies to the philosophy of Mikhail Psellos, from political theory to the interpretation of the Chaldean oracles, which preserves elements of Proclus interpretation. But he has also translated into French the fragments of an Epicurean philosopher, which is something outside the Platonic tradition, the Organise of Inoanda, and by the Édition Universitaire de Fribourg, Swiss, and Édition du Cerf, Paris, 1996. And his translations also include Syrianus' commentary on Aristotle's Metaphysics, books 13 and 14, together with Professor John Dillon in the Commentator series, Duckworth 2006. He has also translated into French and commented upon two Plotinian treatises, that is treatise 51 in the chronological order, that is 1.8 on the origin of evils, Les Éditions du Cerf 1999, and treatise 19, that is 1.2 on the virtues, Vran 2019. His other books include Structure hiérarchique de la pensée de Plotin, Brill, 1975, Studies in Aristotle, the Catholic University of America Press, 1981, Neoplatonism and Christian Thought, an edited volume, State University of New York Press, 1984, Platonic Investigations, another famous edited volume by Catholic University of America Press, 1985. Of course, Pythagoras Revived, Mathematics and Philosophy in Late Antiquity by Oxford University Press, 1989. A comprehensive introduction to the Enneads, Plotinus, an introduction to the Enneads, by Oxford University Press in 1993, reprinted many times, and I was interested by the fact that it has been translated into French, into Italian, but also into Korean, into Lithuanian, but not yet into Greek or Arabic. So perhaps a project for the future. The Structure of Being and the Search of the Good, Essays on Ancient and Early Medieval Platonism, Asgate, 1998. Platonopolis, Platonic Political Philosophy in Late Antiquity, Oxford, 2003. Cosmology and Politics in Plato's Later Works, Cambridge University Press, 2017, and many other publications, which I'm not going to cite today, but today's talk will be on the beauty of the soul, that is virtue. Professor O'Meara, Dominic, thank you again for being here today. We are all ears.
Thank you very much, Irini. Can you hear me?
Yes, perfectly.
Is this all okay?
Everything's fine, yes.
I'll go ahead.
Please.
Okay.
I will share your handout and then share screen, or at least I shall try.
I see John Dillon is there. Wow. Hello, John. So, will I start? Will I start, Irini? Yes?
Yes.
Okay. So let me see. Should I see myself, or is that not
I'm going to share the handout via the chat, and then I will share screen so that we can have the handout on the screen as well, and you will be visible.
Okay, good. Okay,
too.
Good. Okay. So, so the title of my talk is The Reinterpretation of Plato's Cardinal Virtues in Plotinus. I think the originality of Plotinus's theory of virtues has not been fully discerned in scholarship. And here I'd like to bring out this originality as far as I can. And in particular, I'd like to do this by a close reading of a treatise you have mentioned, Irini, the treatise on the virtues, Ennead 1-2, or the 19th treatise in the chronological order. But I'll also refer to some other texts of Plotinus. My talk has got 6 sections. This sounds terrible, but some of the sections are rather short, so it shouldn't be too bad. The first section will consist in a brief recall of some texts in Plato and Aristotle where the virtues are defined, and of how Plotinus takes up Plato's definition of the cardinal virtues in the Republic. Plotinus takes up these definitions in Ennead 1-2, the treatise on the virtues, at the beginning of the treatise in chapter 1, in the context of setting out the problem with which the treatise is going to be concerned, the problem of how we can assimilate to the divine or become similar to the divine through the virtues, even if the divine itself is above virtue. The second section will concern the beginning of Plotinus's development of his solution to this problem of assimilation to the divine in chapter 2. I want to show how Plotinus redefines the cardinal virtues of Plato's Republic in chapter 2, and that this redefinition is presumably a reflection of Plotinus's own view about what these virtues are. And I think the reason for this redefinition is because Plotinus does not accept that there are 3 parts to the nature of soul, a tripartition on which Plato's definition of the virtues is based. In the third section, I want to discuss this thesis that the nature of the soul does not have the 3 parts which we find in Plato's Republic, as Plotinus sees things. And then in the fourth section, I want to come back to Ennead 1-2 on the virtues and show that above the cardinal virtues of the Republic, which Plotinus has redefined, there are what Plotinus calls the greater virtues, which relate to the virtues of purification in Plato's Phaedo. Here also Plotinus reinterprets Plato's text. In the fifth section, I want to talk about the scalar virtues that we have in this treatise, political virtues and then higher or greater virtues. And I want to ask, what kind of a scale of virtues is this? And then in the last section, I'll talk about the distinction between perfect and imperfect virtue in Plotinus. So let's start with the first section. In reading Plato's dialogues, Plotinus could find many discussions about virtue, what virtue is, what the different virtues are, how virtue relates to knowledge, and why virtue is desirable. I would like to recall in particular two passages which were of importance to Plotinus, one in Plato's Phaedo, the other in Plato's Republic. In the Phaedo, Socrates speaks of the separation of soul from the body, the escape of soul, an intellectual nature which is simple, without parts, and immortal, from the prison of the body. Virtues here are described as a purification, katharsis, of the soul from the body. In another passage, in the Republic, Plato writes about the soul not as a nature which is without parts, but as having three parts: the rational part, to logistikon, the spirited part, thumos, and the desiring part, epithumia. In the text, Socrates describes the virtues as excellences relating to the three parts. Four virtues, the so-called cardinal virtues, are defined. Wisdom is the virtue or excellence of the rational part of the soul. Courage is the virtue of the spirited part. Moderation is the virtue of the parts of the soul in agreement with the rule of reason over the other two parts. And justice is what makes the other virtues possible, the principle that each part of the soul fulfills the function proper to it. In other words, that reason rules desire with the help of spirit. This is Republic 441d following. Readers of Plato will wonder how the partless soul of the Phaedo relates to the soul divided into three parts in the Republic. At any rate, the tripartite soul reappears elsewhere in Plato, notably in the Phaedrus and in the Timaeus. I can give you references if you like later. In defining the virtues in the Nicomachean Ethics, Aristotle again uses a division of parts of the soul in order to define the virtues, even if he does not wish to go into the question whether there really are parts in the soul or rather just aspects. Aristotle distinguishes between the rational and the irrational in soul, and then subdivides the irrational into that which can share in reason and that which cannot. Correspondingly, he distinguishes between two kinds of virtue: the virtues of the rational part, these are the intellectual virtues, and the virtues of the irrational part which can be rationally guided, these are the moral virtues. It is clear that Aristotle sees the intellectual virtues as superior, since they are the virtues of what is divine in human nature, reason. And the highest intellectual virtue, wisdom, Sophia, is the only virtue which he thinks, Aristotle, can be worthily ascribed to the gods. Let us now come back to Plotinus and examine in particular his treatise on the virtues, Ennead 1-2. The treatise is concerned with the following problem. In the Theaetetus, Plato speaks of our assimilating ourselves to the divine as far as possible by being just and pious and wise. This idea of assimilation to the divine had become, among the Platonists of Plotinus's era, a definition of the goal or aim to which humans should strive. But Plotinus notes at the beginning of his treatise that there is a problem. If it is by being virtuous that we become similar or assimilate to the divine, how can this be if the divine does not need and indeed is above virtue? Aristotle had already pointed out that the gods do not need and are above the moral virtues, and he was ready to attribute only the highest wisdom to them. So Plotinus also shows at the beginning of his treatise that the divine, whether we take the divine to be the world soul and its intellect, or a transcendent divine intellect, nous, does not have the human virtues, but is above them. How then can we, by being virtuous, become like the divine, which does not have these virtues? But what virtues are we talking about, and what are they? In elaborating in chapter 1, the problem with which the treatise is concerned, Plotinus takes up the definitions of the 4 cardinal virtues, which he calls political virtues, given by Plato in Republic. This is T1. So wisdom, phronesis, has to do with the reasoning part, courage with the spirited part, moderation with an agreement and consonance of desire with reasoning, justice with each part performing its proper function with respect to ruling and being ruled. This is very close to Plato's text, as you can see at the last words in particular. Here, as in Plato, virtues are defined as excellences of 3 different parts of the soul, taken individually and collectively. Such virtues, the political virtues as Plotinus calls them, can hardly be attributed to a transcendent immaterial divinity. How then can they make us similar to this divinity? Plotinus then mentions greater virtues, maizus. As we become clearer a little later in the treatise, in chapter 3, Plotinus is thinking of the virtues of purification of Plato's Phaedo, which he regards as of another kind than the political virtues and as bringing us nearer to a divine life. Summarizing now very rapidly the solution, which Plotinus will propose to the problem discussed in the treatise, we can say that the political virtues and the greater virtues bring us by degrees to higher ways of life, which approach but are not identical with divine life. Thus, political virtues can make our lives, as souls embody to some extent an image of the divine, whereas the greater virtues bring soul, now taken in itself, much nearer the life of transcendent divine intellect. After setting up, so I come now to my section 2. After setting up in chapter 1 the problem to be discussed in the treatise, Plotinus proceeds in chapter 2 to develop his solution. Here he comes back again to the political virtues, introduced already in chapter 1, but he now defines them quite differently. This is T2. So I read the text. The political virtues genuinely set us in order and make us better by giving limit and measure to our desires and putting measure into all our affects, pate, and they abolish false opinions by what is altogether better and by the fact of limitation and the exclusion of the unlimited and indefinite. The political virtues are now defined as a giving of order and limit to desires and affects, and as abolishing false opinions. We notice that these virtues are not now distinguished and defined in relation to 3 different parts of the soul. There is question rather of knowledge, abolishing false opinions, and giving rational order to desires and affects. How can we explain this change in the way of speaking about political virtues? The answer is not far to seek, I think. Plotinus does not think that spirit and desire are parts of the nature of soul. And so a division of the soul into 3 parts cannot serve to define the political virtues. Another way of defining them is required. In the first chapter of the treatise, where the problem to be discussed is set forth, Plotinus has recalled Plato's definitions in the Republic of the cardinal virtues, but now, as he turns in chapter 2 to developing his solution to the problem, he starts from his own definitions of these virtues, definitions which result from his own conception of soul. Let's look briefly at this conception. So I'm now in part 3 of my paper. In one of the first treatises he composed, Ennead 4:7, Plotinus argued against the Stoics, Epicureans, and Aristotelians that soul is not of a corporeal nature, nor is it some entity whose existence depends on body. Soul is not characterized by mass as are bodies, bodies which are quantities occupying separate places, having constituent parts and being subject to change and destruction. The radical ontological difference between soul and body is emphasized in Ennead 6:4-5, written near the period of the treatise on the virtues, Ennead 1:2. Soul, Plotinus here argues, is not a whole made up of parts in the way a body is, nor it is a one and many in the way that bodies are. This means that soul can be present as one and as a whole in different parts of a body without being fragmented, the presence of which bodies are incapable, and that souls can be present both in each other and in the whole of soul, which is also present in each of them, a presence impossible for bodies between themselves. Excuse me. The radical difference between the nature of soul and that of bodies, and the independence of soul with respect to the body, means that soul is impassible with respect to the body. It is not subject to the various kinds of change which affect the body, a position which Plotinus defends in Ennead 3:6, number 26, chronologically speaking. Here in chapter 2, Plotinus introduces the tripartite soul of Plato's Republic, arguing that regarding virtue and vice, the three parts of the soul are not affected or changed by these, but that virtue and vice are rather a matter of these parts not looking to rational guidance. He adds, however, and this is in chapter 2 at the end, but perhaps most often what we call the vice of this part is a bad state of the body, and virtue the opposite, so that in either case nothing is added to the soul. End of quote. In what follows, Plotinus describes affects, pathe, such as fear, as taking place not in soul but in something else, the body. More precisely, as Plotinus makes clear in Ennead 4:4, chapters 18-21, the body which is the subject of affects is the living body, a composite or combination, to sunam photon, what Plotinus calls something common, to koinon. That is, a body to which is joined a trace, ichnos, of soul, which enlivens the body. Living body illuminated by soul receives a trace of soul. A body which lacks or has lost this trace is dead. The living body and the affects to which it is subject are to be distinguished from the soul, which can, however, perceive the affects in the living body and consequently react. Pain in the living body can be perceived by rational soul, which may decide to take measures to protect the body. Or a judgment in soul, for example, that something is unjust, can provoke a corresponding affect, anger, in the living body. So the emotions associated with spirit and desire in Plato's tripartite soul are in fact affects of the qualified body and are not part of the nature of soul. Plotinus expresses the difference between the individual rational soul and the living body to which it relates as a distinction between we, imais, and what is ours, emeteron. We are the rational soul. What is ours is the living body in our charge. The spirited and desirous parts of which Plato wrote are not part of the nature of soul. They are affects belonging to the body. The same ideas can be found in a late treatise, Ennead 1:1, where Plotinus raises the question as to what it is to which belong pleasures and pains, fears and assurances, desires and aversions. Soul using body, or a third which arises from these. In assigning these affects to the living body in chapter 7, Plotinus returns to his distinction between the nature of the individual human soul, which is rational, and the living body which is in its care, formulating this distinction again, once again as one between we and what is ours. We are the rational soul, the living body is just ours, as that to which our soul relates. Affects and emotions such as anger and physical desire have their seat not in soul but in the living body. They are not part of the nature of soul. The affects can give rise to false opinions and mislead soul. It is thus soul's task as a purely rational nature to bring rational order to the chaotic and unmeasured affects which may arise in the living body. Affects of which soul is aware, also rejecting the false opinions which can be generated by these irrational affects. In this way, Plotinus comes to conceive of the virtues not as excellences of parts, rational and irrational, of the soul, but as order given by rational soul, inspired by wisdom, to the affects and emotions arising in the living body, a wisdom which also dispels false opinions. The differentiation in Plato's Republic between the virtues in function of the three parts of the soul disappears in Plotinus's definitions of the virtues in Ennead 1-2, chapter 2. The political virtues are the knowledge, rational order, and measure brought by soul to affects and emotions arising in the living body. Thus, courage is a measure brought to feelings of fear, and its opposite, moderation, is order brought to physical desires. I come now to the next section on the greater virtues. But what of the greater virtues which Plotinus found mentioned in Plato's Phaedo, and which he introduced in Ennead 1-2 as representing a greater assimilation of the soul to the divine? Here too we can detect a modification introduced by Plotinus. In chapter 4 of the treatise, Plotinus takes up the idea of the Phaedo that the virtues are purification, and he argues that such virtues are not the process of being purified, but rather the state of soul having been purified. The concept of virtue, arete, suggests some kind of excellence, which is reached by a process of purification, but which is not this process itself. Plotinus describes these greater virtues in chapter 3 negatively, excuse me, as souls not being related to bodily affects, but acting alone and guided by intellect, and again positively in chapter 6 as follows. This is at T3. I'm sorry, I had some nuts before I started my talk, and they're sticking in my throat. It's a bad thing to do. Anyway, T3. Wisdom, Sophia and phronesis, consists in the contemplation of that which intellect contains. The higher justice in the soul is its activity towards intellect. Its moderation is its inward turning to intellect. Its courage is its freedom from affects, not sharing in the affects of its inferior companion, the living body. From these definitions, we can see that the greater virtues, that is the virtues of this, the virtues that you reach after the process of purification, these greater virtues consist in rational soul's complete orientation to and contemplation of the transcendent divine intellect, and in its freedom from being affected in any way by what might occur in its own living body. Some questions might be asked about these greater virtues. Why does Plotinus find the four cardinal virtues, as we can see, again at this higher level? Are these virtues really different from each other? Given their definitions, they'd hardly seem to be different from each other. I will return to these questions in the next section, but for the moment we can conclude that Plotinus sees assimilation to the divine in two phases: in knowledge and rational order brought by soul to the affects and emotions of the living body, and a complete turning of soul back to contemplating transcendent divine intellect. In the lower phase, soul turns towards what is outside it, its living body and the material world, and in bringing rational order to these, produces an image of divine life. In the higher phase, soul turns to itself, contemplating the divine intellect which it can find in itself, and thus sharing much more closely in the life of this intellect. This, I think we can say, is neither Plato's theory of virtue nor that of Aristotle. Virtues are neither a function of parts of the soul nor purifications, strictly speaking. Virtues are not defined into intellectual and subordinate moral virtues, but all virtues are intellectual, relating either to bringing knowledge and giving rational order to the affects of the living body as it functions in the material world, or to contemplating a transcendent divine intellect. To illustrate Plotinus' theory of virtue, it might be helpful to note the way in which he interprets Plato's phrase in the Theaetetus passage I referred to about assimilation to the divine as far as possible. Plotinus considers the question of the possible in chapters 5 and 6 of the treatise on virtues. In Aeneid 1-2, he describes a range of degrees of the possible, going from the assimilation to the divine reached in the political virtues up to that reached in the greater virtues. Thus, for example, with regard to pains suffered in the living body, the soul will try to tolerate them and diminish them by trying not to share in these affects, or even better, it will try to eliminate them entirely. Soul will also seek to free itself entirely from movements of anger in the living body, or at least it will try not to be carried away by them. With regard to carnal desires, soul will not indulge in excessive eating and drinking, which does not mean that it will not meet the natural and necessary needs of the living body for food and drink. This is made clear with regard to sexual desire, to aphrodisia. The best for this, the highest degree, is to exclude sexual desire entirely. This would be the case, we can assume, on the level of the greater virtues. But Plotinus also allows for rationally chosen and natural sexual desires. Here political virtues would be concerned, presumably in the context of a good and natural management of the life of the living body. I'm coming to the fifth section, virtues as constituting a scale. Plotinus distinguishes, as has been seen above, between two sorts of virtues: the political virtues, which have to do with soul's relation to its living body and the material world, and the greater virtues, which have to do with soul in itself as turning to and contemplating a transcendent divine intellect. These two sorts of virtues clearly form a scale. The greater virtues bring us much nearer to divine life than do the political virtues. But can we say more about this scale of two levels of virtue? It has been noted that Aristotle distinguishes between intellectual virtues and moral virtues, and that he regards the intellectual virtues as superior, as being excellences of reason, which is what is divine in human nature. In Aristotle, the two kinds of virtue concern different parts or aspects of the soul, and they both contribute together to living a fulfilled human life. Aristotle does not think of the virtues in the way that Plotinus does, as two different orientations of soul, towards the living body and towards divine intellect. Nor does Plotinus distinguish his two levels of virtue as a distinction between moral and intellectual virtues. Both levels of virtue are intellectual. It is their orientation that is different. In Plato, we can suppose that the purifications that are virtues in the Phaedo are somehow superior to the cardinal virtues of the Republic. But here again, as we have seen, Plotinus modifies Plato's descriptions of the virtues. What then is the precise nature of the scale of two levels of virtue in Plotinus? In the treatise on virtue, Plotinus asks, this is in chapter 2, line 10 to 13, what is it that is common, koinon, to the two kinds of virtue? What is it that makes them virtue? To judge from these questions, it seems that he thinks that there is something common to the two kinds of virtue, something which makes all of them to be virtuous. While there may be something common to all virtues and to the two kinds of virtue, the two kinds are also on two levels, one kind being superior to the other. what sort of scale or hierarchy might this imply? One structure which might be considered as relevant would be a scale constituted of a genus and its coordinate and subordinate species. Thus, in this structure, there would be a genus, virtue, common to the two species of virtue. However, Plotinus's two kinds of virtue are clearly not coordinate species. One is superior to the other. Another possibility, thinking about the sort of scale that there might be here, would be to say that the word virtue is homonymous in the sense of being ambiguous. Although being the same, the word virtue means different things for each of the two kinds of virtue, so that in fact there is nothing essentially common to the two different kinds. This is clearly not an option that Plotinus wants to take. It seems to me that there remains one structure which would fit Plotinus' scale of two kinds of virtue, the structure constituted by a series of terms related as prior and posterior to each other. This is different from a genus-species structure, a series in which the first term of the series is the best instance and the cause of lesser instances of the same property in the series. A series in which the name of the property is not homonymous in the sense of ambiguity, but has meanings all related to that signifying the primary instance in the series. The concept of a series of terms which are prior and posterior to each other, while sharing the same name and property, is used by Plotinus in the treatise on virtues to describe the relation between the intellection characteristic of the transcendent divine intellect and intellection in so. This is 3:26-27. Intellection, Noein, in both cases is not a homonymous term in the sense of ambiguity, but the intellection which is in divine intellect is primary, protos, compared to the intellection in so, which is derived from and an image of primary intellection. Indeed, we might say that such a series is in general fundamental to Plotinus' view of reality, as a series of degrees of unity, goodness, beauty, and life cascading down at various degrees, in which the lower degrees are images of the higher degrees, the highest degree being the highest instance of a property, being also the cause of the lower instances and what is common to them all. Applying this structure to the scale constituted by Plotinus' two kinds of virtue, I think that we are in a position to explain how there can be something common to virtues which makes them all virtue, even if the virtues make up a scale of two levels of virtue. What is common to virtues, what makes them virtues, is the highest instance of virtue, the greater virtues. The political virtues are derivative and secondary. What is virtue in them comes from the greater virtues. The consequences of seeing Plotinus' two kinds of virtue in this light are considerable, as will be seen in the next section. In the meantime, I would like to come back to some questions raised earlier. Why is it that Plotinus finds the four cardinal virtues of Plato's Republic, the political virtues, again on the level of the greater virtues, and why it is that these greater virtues seem hardly distinguishable from each other in the definitions Plotinus gives of them? I think that we are now in a position to provide answers to these questions. As for the first question, a simple answer would be to say that these virtues are also named in the part of Plato's Phaedo where the virtues are described as purification, and so Plotinus simply takes them over from Plato. But I think that the concept of a series of prior and posterior terms gives a deeper and more philosophical explanation. If the four cardinal virtues found on the level of political virtues stand in a non-ambiguous homonymous relationship with the greater virtues, then the same virtues will be found again in a higher and primary form among the greater virtues. Indeed, the greater virtues taken together as virtue are what makes what is virtue in the images of them on the level of the political virtues. This explanation also throws light on what happens later with Plotinus' successors, Plotinus's pupil Porphyry added two new levels of virtue, purificatory and paradigmatic virtues, and later Platonus, Iamblichus, Proclus, and others added even more levels of virtue, natural, ethical, and theurgic virtues. At all of these levels, the four cardinal virtues were to be found, according to these Platonists. The explanation of this is that both the word virtue and the names of the four cardinal virtues are homonymous in a non-ambiguous way, in such a way that these virtues will be found throughout a series of higher and lower levels of virtue, the lower levels being images of the higher. Coming then to my second question, why in Plotinus the greater virtues, in the definitions he gives of them, seem hardly distinguishable from each other, we can answer that the higher we go up the scale of virtues, the greater is the unity which they constitute. As the turning of soul to the contemplation of transcendent divine intellect, the virtues become one virtue, an image of the unity of divine intellect and its thought. On the level of the political virtues, the soul finds its virtue diversified by the variety of affects, emotions, and circumstances to which it should bring order. But when completely turned to intellect, the soul does not have to deal with this diversity. So I come to the final section of my paper. Let us now suppose that we have been able to develop in ourselves Plotinus's two kinds of virtue, and that we have acquired both the political and the greater virtues. What happens then? Is this like the situation, for example, in which we set out on a journey and we need to pass through intermediary points in order to reach our destination? In such case, once we reach our destination, we can forget the intermediate stages through which we passed, and we do not need to go back to them. Or is it perhaps like an educational curriculum in which you need to acquire first some lower diplomas in order to have access to and obtain higher diplomas? Once you have acquired the higher diplomas, you can forget the lower ones. So, if we reach the greater virtues, can we just forget the political virtues that we have already acquired, since they would seem to serve only as stepping stones to reach something higher, stepping stones which we no longer need? This seems hardly likely. As long as the human individual soul has its living body in its care and relates to the material world in which its body lives, it will need to make use of political virtues. Thus Plotinus thinks that the soul possessing the greater virtues will also make use of the political virtues as circumstances require. This is the last text, T4. Let's see, the possessor of the political virtues will know them and how much he can get from them. And he would sometimes act according to some of them as circumstances require, but coming to higher principles and different measures, he will act according to these. Does this mean then that the soul possessing the greater virtues, having acquired the political virtues and acting in the material world, will simply apply the political virtues in the way, for example, that if we have learned how to ride a bicycle and then go on to learn to drive a car, we can easily ride a bicycle again if needed? Are the political virtues acquired once and for all, so that the soul which reaches the greater virtues merely needs to reactivate the political virtues whenever this is required? The situation does not seem to be so simple for the following reasons. Political virtue, as the bringing of rational order to affects and emotions which arise in the living body and as choosing actions, involves a practical wisdom which includes not only knowledge of particular circumstances, but also knowledge of the principles which should guide choices and actions, principles which are inspired by the wisdom reached by the greater virtues. Plotinus makes this point in a treatise written more or less at the same time as the treatise on virtues, the treatise on dialectic, Ennead 1:3. Here, according to this text, practical wisdom receives much of its knowledge from a higher wisdom, Sophia. which we can identify as belonging to the greater virtues. The conclusion which can be inferred from this is that wisdom on the level of the political virtues should be inspired by and depends on wisdom on the level of the greater virtues. Or, to put it another way, political virtues without the inspiring presence of the greater virtues is defective, incomplete. The point is made at the end of Ennead 1.3. Lower virtues may precede, but they grow with higher virtue, which helps them develop and perfects them. Chapter 6:14-24. Thus we can say that political virtues are only fully possessed when the greater virtues are also achieved. If a person has the political virtues but not the greater virtues, then these political virtues are imperfect and await their completion when the greater virtues are reached. To be fully virtuous on the level of the political virtues is not only to have knowledge of particulars and circumstances, but it is also to know the good and the fine, as these may be known on the level of the greater virtues, through contemplation of the divine transcendent intellect. This intellect is itself beauty and the highest knowledge of the absolute good, the One. The situation is different from what we find in Aristotle's Ethics, where practical wisdom, phronesis, is separated from and independent of theoretical wisdom, Sophia. And we are nearer to Plato's view that knowledge of the transcendent forms, the form of justice, for example, should guide our actions. So I come to my conclusion. Plotinus' theory of the soul brings innovations in his ethics. His views on the nature of soul mean that irrational emotions and effects are no longer a part of the nature of the individual human soul. They belong to the living body. Consequently, Plotinus does not define the virtues, as did Plato in the Republic and as did Aristotle, in terms of different parts of the soul. Soul is a purely rational nature, and virtue is the wisdom it has. The wisdom which allows it to bring rational order to emotions, affects, and actions, and to dismiss false opinions that might arise from the affects of the living body. This wisdom depends on the contemplation of transcendent divine intellect, which is higher virtue. The problem is to bring soul to exercise fully its power to contemplate intellect, so that it is strong enough in itself to prevail over the irrational influences which come to it from its living body. Ordering the affairs of the living body and its connection with the corporeal world is something which the soul desires, as part of its nature, which is to communicate what is good and beautiful. Soul also needs to order the affects of the living body so that they do not distract it and limit its freedom to function as a rational soul, to contemplate divine intellect. However, all of this is not the individual human soul's main goal or aim. To take care of the living body and its affairs is natural to soul, but what human soul deeply desires and seeks for itself is something else: contemplation of divine intellect, sharing in the life of divine intellect as a way of approaching union with the absolute good, the One. Thank you very much for your patience.
Thank you very much for this very clear and soul elevating talk.
Thank you.
I would like to invite the audience now. All questions or comments are welcome, so please just raise hand or use the chat. Yes, Professor Afonassin.
Dominic, so thank you for your talk. It's, it's like the lecture on the good. And since the listeners still remain, so you're probably more successful than our venerated predecessor Plato in this lecture. Very simple question. Do you it goes a little bit maybe away from the exact subject of your talk, but do you think that all this elaborated device of later Platonists like Iamblichus, who invented 7 degrees of perfection, of arete is really excessive. I mean, in a sense, Plotinus, when he added on Plato another level of arete, which allows a person to contemplate paradigms. Yeah, is simply this is sufficient. You don't really need all this hierarchical or ethical or political well, you need it, or some other levels of arete which were invented by later Platonists, or not, or there is some point in this. I mean, something new added in our understanding on to what arete actually means.
Yes, I can answer. Yeah, it's very good to see the two of you. Wonderful, in fact.
Yes.
That's, for me, that's the biggest thing. Okay, but I'll try to answer the question. I like Plotinus' sobriety. I like his economy, and I get very irritated when they give 4 levels of virtue to Plotinus. I think he's wonderful because he doesn't do this business of 4 levels, 6 levels, 7 levels, and so on. And it's very clear. He says that virtue is a disposition of the soul, so you can't attribute it to nous, okay? And he also says that virtue, the chapter 4 of Ennead 1-2 is a very complicated, difficult chapter to understand, and people don't pay attention very much to the fact that he doesn't think that there are purificatory virtues, in the sense that purification is a process leading to a virtue, but not a virtue itself. But then Porphyry comes along and adds 2 more. You know, he didn't read Plotinus properly in this respect, anyway, or at least I think he somewhat changes things. Why? I think, for example, in the case of the theurgic virtues, perhaps the introduction of theurgy in later Neoplatonism by Iamblichus meant that you needed this level. And then the fact that they read Aristotle very systematically in later Neoplatonism and Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics, where you can find natural and ethical virtues. The ethical virtues in the sense of virtues that are acquired by just training, like children and animals. They integrated this into the Platonic system. But yeah, I don't know. I'm not convinced that this is all very necessary. And maybe it's just this spirit of sort of scholastic systematization and eclecticism and making something out of all of these different sources. But for me, the most serious problem, and there my thesis is a bit radical. I think Plotinus is talking about the soul turning in 2 different directions, taking care of the living body on one hand, on the other hand, contemplating nous. So actually, we don't have a stratificational system, where you've got one sort of virtue and then you go up to the next. It's like a building with 6 stories. It's not like that at all. It's the virtue is more a question of in what way, in what direction are you looking? And if you're looking towards the living body and you don't possess knowledge, then you can't be virtuous. And you get this knowledge, at least let's say the ethical norms. You get that from contemplating intellect. And so this is not a stratificational way of looking at the virtues, or looking at the virtues as if they're stories in a building, but this question of orientation. That's it. I've stated rather radically, but I think the problem with having 6, 7, who knows, you could add an 8 if you like, levels of virtue, is maybe you end up in this kind of stratificational way of looking at things. Whereas if it's just a question of turning in one direction or the other, it's something quite different, and you don't need this. So that's my opinion anyway.
Thank you.
Thank you. So any other questions or thoughts for the moment? If not, I may ask.
Please.
Yes, thank you. So I have two questions. The first one continues what you have just been discussing, so I'd rather start from this one.
Okay.
I was thinking also about the correspondence with Porphyry. So if my understanding is correct, Plotinus' greater virtues correspond to what Porphyry calls intellective virtues. So the Porphyry's cathartic virtues are not found in Plotinus. So it seems as if Porphyry were doing something that he does, I think that he does in his metaphysics as well. That is, he underlines the intermediate state.
Yeah.
So in his metaphysics, this gives us triads.
Yes.
If we suppose that the commentary on the Parmenides is Porphyry's, or to someone who is who belongs to Porphyry's school of thought. And here, in fact, we can, in a way, find Porphyry's theory in Plotinus if we posit that he underlines the intermediate state, and then the paradigmatic virtues are, of course, at the level of intellect. So
yes.
that was the way I.
Yeah. Yes. Yes. This I think this relates also to the earlier question. And there is, I forgot to say this, that there is this mentality of putting in intermediates, and it gets worse and worse as late antiquity becomes even later. Okay, so the levels multiply all the time, because you apparently need intermediaries to unite things, and then you need intermediaries between intermediaries, and sort of yeah. So there may be this way of thinking too, that you need to have a sort of between the stories you need a sort of a mezzanine or something like that. So you maybe climbing up the stairs is easier if there's a kind of a break between stories and a sort of semi-story. Sorry, I'm being a little frivolous with this thinking, but there's a bit of that.
No, thank you. It is perhaps the thumos saying that we need a third term to combine.
Yeah. Yes.
Combine
yes. Of course, this is already in Plato. Yes, and in fact, you need two.
Yes, and then the intermediate terms are multiplied ad infinitum. Okay, so thank you for this. My second question, before I think there is another question, but let me ask my second one perhaps now. What you said about a series of prior and posterior terms. Do you think that you mentioned my paper on Plotinus demonology? So I wonder whether what Plotinus means by a demon could also be described in terms of a series of prior and posterior terms, as in the case of virtue.
Oh gosh, I don't know. What do you think?
I thought that that was what you meant when you mentioned my paper on demon.
Oh, yeah. Yes.
A demon can be at the level of intellect, and
yes.
that's a god, or at the level of the higher soul.
Yeah.
So an intermediate entity between gods and men.
Yes. No, why not? I don't see any reason why not. Yes, certainly. I was thinking more of your general presentation of his concept of soul. But yes, you could fit that in. I don't see any problems with that.
Thank you very much. I think there are more questions, so I'd rather stop. And Jonathan, you have a question. Jonathan Gregg has written on the chat, I have a question, but unfortunately I'm on a train with a wobbly connection, so better to type out. So I'm reading it. Many thanks for your talk, Dominic. This is somewhat of a tangent, apologies in advance, but I wonder if Plotinus' way of framing the virtues, that is, in terms of orientating and as including the middle lower tier of political virtues, could explain the way Michail Psellos advocates for aiming at political virtues rather than purely contemplative, that is, totally apart from the political embodied level. Do you think there may be a connection here? I could be wrong.
No, I don't think you are. Jonathan, I don't know if you can hear me in the train, but Psellos, I've sort of presented Plotinus in terms of this idea of two orientations. And interestingly enough, Psellos takes this up, and although he knows very well the later Neoplatonic theories of virtue, these scales of virtue, hierarchies of virtue that you find in Porphyry and in Iamblichus and in Proclus, Psellos knows this material very well. Yet it's striking that I think in the Chronographia, I don't have the references in mind at the moment, but it's striking that he seems to think of this whole hierarchy as subsumed in some way under a kind of basic division between being involved in the material affairs of the living body and turning towards the higher contemplative life. So I think Psellos has really this never occurred to me before. Thank you for your question. I think maybe he's read Plotinus very well there, although he does use the other stuff as well. But then political virtues for him, he gives them quite a great importance, and he's happier, so to speak, living on that level. And he accepts the superiority of the contemplative life, but it's not really for him at the moment, anyway. And he finds that the life of the soul in the body is important and should be taken care of, and this is where we need to direct our efforts. Although he will admire the higher life. But I think you're right. I think maybe Psellos has noticed. If I'm right about Plotinus, then Psellos has seen this also. Thank you very much, Jonathan. If you like, I can try to send you some references in Psellos later on.
Thank you. I got all that. Thank you. Please do. That is Jonathan.
Okay.
And Matthew, please.
Yes, thank you for that very fascinating lecture. One passage in Plotinus I think has some relevance is Ennead 6-8-5 on the free will and of the one,
Yes.
where he describes virtue as intellectualizing the soul.
Yes.
And then I guess to kind of push on you on the question of the view of the virtues in Plotinus as an orientation, the way Plotinus describes the political and cathartic virtues' effects on the passions seems like a continuum, where the political virtues moderate the passions, And then eventually with the cathartic virtues, they purify, or also, as you point out, at least purify to the point that they're able to.
I see what you mean. Yes. Yes. The reference to 6.8 is very good. I think he describes. I'm looking for the passage.
The very end of section 5.
Yeah. Anyway, we find the two kinds of virtue in 6.8, and we find the higher virtue as being described as nous, actually, but nous of the soul. And now, to what extent, I think your question is, to what extent do the political virtues exercise a kind of purificatory function? Is this correct? Let me see. Plotinus talks about purification as being a separation. When it specifies what it means by purification, it means a separation of the soul from the body. This is a separation, a philosophical separation of the soul from the body. So, to what extent does exercising the political virtues help produce this separation of the soul from the body? It would seem that the political virtues, I'm sorry, the sun is shining in my face, so I have to get out of that sun. It seems that the political virtues have to do with, let's say, managing the affects and managing more broadly your life in the living body. So you're turned towards the outside, and I'm thinking at the moment, in what way could being occupied with or turning towards external affairs in the material world produce this separation of the soul from the body? That's not clear to me. If I can come back to the distinction I was proposing between perfect and imperfect virtue, and this is not really anything new. You can find it in Middle Platonism already, this distinction. Imperfect virtue, let's put it that way, can imperfect virtue help you separate from separate yourself, that is soul, rational soul, from the body and its affairs? It's not clear to me that it can. Maybe what's the use of imperfect virtue, you might say, political virtue? Why bother with it at all then? I'm trying to think this through, because the treatise itself doesn't help us with this. I think maybe what imperfect political virtue can achieve is to at least bring some sort of peace to the soul, to the rational soul. What Plotinus seems to be worried about is that that soul will not be able to function in what it is as a rational soul. It'll be distracted or pulled away by material problems or even material values. And so maybe political virtues in their imperfect form, that is before you've reached the higher virtues, could sort of diminish to some extent this problem of the soul being torn away from what it should really be doing, which is thinking. So maybe it helps to some extent. It maybe prepares the ground for the separation. Perfect political virtue. Let's see. Well, there's no problem there. Everything is you've got everything. You're not going to be seduced or influenced or distracted or taken away from thinking if you really got perfect virtue. I'm trying to find an answer to your question, but it's not easy. It's not easy. I want to the concept of purification, which Plotinus takes from Plato. It has, I think, the sense of this kind of religious background of initiation and purifying yourself of whatever it is, in order to be able to enter into the presence of the divine. And this idea of initiation to the presence of the divine is then transposed in Plato to dealing with virtue. I don't think this in Plotinus is so much emphasis on this initiation, and somehow he thinks that we just have to free our souls of distractions and to start thinking, contemplating intellect, and maybe the political virtues in their imperfect form may help prepare the ground for this. Let's say if you can calm down this noisy neighbor, okay, which is your living body, if you can calm it down a little bit, eventually you'll at last be able to think. And so maybe the political virtues can do this. I don't know if I'm coming anyway towards answering your question.
Yes, thank you.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you. Anne?
Yes. Okay, so thank you. I thought that was a wonderful talk. And I was persuaded by everything you said. And then when I started thinking about it, the idea that the two levels of virtue in Plotinus are like a series of terms which are prior and posterior, I mean, and that's what's being picked up, that's also true of the later multiplicative levels of virtue, that made a lot of sense. But then isn't that a little bit in tension with the idea that Plotinus isn't really talking about levels, he's talking about the soul turning in two different directions? I mean, that seemed very persuasive as well, but I just wondered whether those two things are completely consistent with each other.
Very good. Thank you, Anne. This is great. I'm seeing lots of old friends. You're perfectly right.
I mean, maybe it's both, and that there are the sort of the seeds of both ideas there. I don't know.
Yes, I've thought about this. And the only, there is a problem, okay, I admit. And yeah, I think there is a hierarchy in terms of the objects to which you turn your attention. So there's the sensible things, the material things. This is the best I've been able to come with so far to get rid of my internal contradiction. There are levels in the sense that there's the material world on the one hand, and then there's divine intellect on the other. So the orientation, it's the same soul. One soul which turns in these different directions, and the fact that the objects to which it gives its attention to constitute a hierarchy maybe is enough to say that there are two levels. What do you think?
No, thank you. I think that's very helpful. Yeah, thanks.
Is that enough? Or
yes. Well, I think so. Yes, I need to go and think.
Great.
About it,
thank you very much.
Yes, thank you. Flora has a question, but there is also before that a question on the chat by Snow. So I shall read that. if I may, if all is part of the one, while the one transcends all, then wouldn't the political virtues turning one outwards be another form of turning towards the one? Might it also help one to set up a life that would afford the possibility of more contemplative endeavors if one is living in a more virtuous manner on a daily level?
Thank you very much. I think this is true. One can imagine. I don't want to push Plotinus too hard on this, but if we can imagine a world, okay, and we're very, very, very far from this world, where people are not driven by anger and greed and lust and money, where there's some sort of rational organization of things, and we care for each other. If we can imagine such a world, in other words, a world where the political virtues are exercised in the light of wisdom, the knowledge, for example. I'd mention one norm which I think is Plotinus would accept entirely, which is that the good does not do evil, and the good produces good. It doesn't produce evil. But the question of evil is another question. But anyway, it's not good to hurt other people or to kill them. This is, I think, a norm derived from knowledge of the good, and it should be applied to our lives in the living body. So when we see, Plotinus talks about this, when we see injustice, we are angry. But this is anger is triggered in the living body by our knowledge that this is contrary to what the good is. Okay, so in such a world, then the life in the body can be a good and a beautiful thing. And in fact, I've mentioned this very quickly. It can be an image of the divine. In other words, we can turn our lives into images of divine. But of course, the reality is completely different, and we're very far from living like that, and the world is very far from being, at least with respect to our vices, very far from being an image of the divine. Of course, in terms of the world itself, the natural world itself, it is an image of the divine. It's just our lives that are not. Our lives are ugly and shameful. And in general, I think this is Plotinus's feeling that, and also we're not able to really think because we're completely torn by these material desires. So, yeah. So I think the political virtues, as things are for Plotinus, they're rare and they're necessary. And but what is more important is the theoretical life. But if one were to suppose, this is science fiction, okay? If one were to suppose that human souls in general had the higher virtues and then lived according to these higher virtues, we'd be living in a very different human world anyway than the one that we live in now. And the good and the one would be sort of percolating down, not only into the world as it is, but also in our lives, in our living bodies. I don't know if this is if you want to discuss a little bit more this question, or if you disagree.
Thank you. Thank you for that great response from Snow.
Thank you. Thank you.
And Flora.
Yes, thank you very much. I'd like to come back on this idea of orientation of the cell. I find it very difficult to understand, and I would be very interested in what you think of the relationship between this idea of the cell being able to look either towards the material body and the intellect with this concept that Plotinus uses all throughout the Enneads, and especially I'm thinking about this second chapter of treatise 33-9 of the meson, tall meson. How do you link your idea of cell being able to look in both directions and this reality, but actually, is it a reality, or is this meson, this toe meson, simply the name that Plotinus gives to this capacity that our cells have to look in both directions? In other words, ontologically speaking, I don't know how to formulate it. How do you explain this capacity that our cells would have if our cell is essentially rational? How can it be orientated both ways?
Okay, this is 2.9 chapter 3.
Yeah, 2.9 chapter 2.
Chapter 2.
Was this idea of the cell? He says that there are three aspects of three things of our cell. One is always directed upwards, so towards the intellect, and the other downwards. And then there's this intermediary entity that is called the toe meson, but you find it elsewhere in the Enneads, of course. But this passage is well, strikes. I have very much difficulty to understand it, but for me, it's very closely linked to what you developed, this idea of two orientations.
Yes, I'll have to read this passage quietly by myself and probably not understand it. So I can't give you an answer about this passage in particular. Soul is so. Well, this idea of orientation is not all that new. You have this this idea of the mobile self that you find in Platonian studies, and you sort of soul goes up and it goes down, and it's able to fix itself, so to speak, at all sorts of levels. So our self seems to be mobile, to use this language, and it all depends on what we're concentrating on, what we're paying attention to. So the idea of orientation relates to this. Are we going to concentrate on whether we're going to have a good dinner or not, or are we going to concentrate on the unity of subject and object in knowledge or something like that? So I think orientation is just maybe another way of expressing this idea, except I'm using it with respect to virtue. People talk about the mobile self, perhaps not particularly with respect to virtue. So soul can pretty well go everywhere. It's in the nature of soul to be linked to divine intellect on the one hand, but then it has in its own nature also this richness, which leads it to wish to express its richness in creating the world, and in fact, and in occupying our bodies in individual souls. So we reach down and we reach up, And I think there's a continuity. There's it's a life, in fact, that moves up and down, and so the soul's rational nature reaches down and as well as up, and reaches down, taking on, you might say, the modality of aesthesis, of perception. And then so soul knows what's going on in the living body. It perceives. Aesthesis, in a way, it's a sort of a modality of rationality. I think it's maybe I can say something about Plotinus' psychology in terms of the idea of different faculties or powers of soul. And I think when we talk about rational soul, I think it's perhaps not good to talk about rational soul as the rationality of soul as a faculty of soul. Okay, if you look at for example, the Aristotelian concept of soul, you've got different faculties and they're stratified. Okay, and you've got the lower faculties, and practically all living things have these things, and then you go up and and then there are not that many animals who've got rationality, apparently, and that's the top of this stratificational way of thinking. I don't think Plotinus thinks like that at all. It's the reverse. And so rationality is not a specific faculty among other faculties of the soul, but actually rationality is the original nature of soul, which then extends itself in different modalities down into the world. I think this is quite a different way of thinking. And so you shouldn't say the soul is rational, as if the soul possesses some specific, so to speak, characteristic, or, as if it's one faculty, but rather it's the original faculty of soul, but it's so rich that it extends itself down in creating the world and in inhabiting bodies. And this rationality, you find it right, so to speak, at the bottom in aesthesis. Yeah. So I don't know if is this okay?
Yes, thank you very much.
You're welcome. But I look at the passage, okay, in 2:9.
Thank you. Aram?
Thank you for your, can you hear me?
Yes, I can, thank you.
Okay, thank you for your fascinating lecture, Professor O'Meara. I have a question about Plotinus' division between the political virtues and the higher virtues. In the light of the general problematic that Plotinus addresses here, on how we assimilate to divinity. So is the idea that only the higher virtues can assimilate us to divinity, or also the political virtues? Because in that case, there's that problem of Plotinus that the divine does not possess the virtues. It's only in order. If there are like two kinds of ways in which we can assimilate to the divine by the virtues. Yes, thank you.
Yes. If we say that assimilation to the divine means sharing in some way in divine life, and that means for Plotinus sharing in the life of divine intellect. If we say that, then it's the higher or greater virtues that give us this. When we exercise the greater virtues, we are participating in the life of nous. Okay. The political virtues, they don't give this participation, but on the other hand, they do communicate the divine, if they are true political virtues. So Plotinus, I think, in the treatise shows that he doesn't want to dismiss the political virtues as if they're of no importance. Okay, he thinks they are important. In fact, it's a condition, the necessary condition for us to be able to reach the greater virtues. But if we're going to talk about sharing in divine life, then it is the greater virtues that do this. I think. Okay.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you. I cannot see any more questions or hands raised. Professor Dillon, are you raising hand? Yes. Well, we cannot hear you. Please, you need to unmute. Okay. Yes. Yes. No. Okay.
Unmute?
No. Great.
Yes. First of all, I must apologize, Dominic. Some old friends came to call, and we had to give them a drink. So I missed most of the talk, but I was looking forward to it. And I was wondering, just apropos of what you were saying last, I've been intrigued in 1-2 about what, say, Porphyry would call the paradigmatic virtues. I think Plotinus really regards them as sort of paradigms of virtues. But do you think perhaps, considering that Plotinus had this feeling, this belief that there was a part of us, our soul that does not descend, and if it's in the intelligible world, it can't even really be a soul, it's a kind of nous. Does it have perhaps paradigms of virtue that would assimilate it to the gods?
Yes.
Or is this fantastic?
Not at all. It's great to see you, John. I haven't seen you for some time.
Good. I'm glad to get back in time.
Good to see that you're quite well. Yes.
Reasonably well. Thanks.
Reasonably well, that's right. As much as one can expect. Let's see. I think the soul is, there's this problem with the intelligible world. There's nous and the nous, the intellects, and they're many in one in many. And then you have soul and souls.
Yeah.
So I think soul is an intelligible reality, an intelligible nature, but it is a product of nous. So it's something different from nous. There's a difference between soul and intellect, between psyche and nous. So they're not the same. Soul is a creation of nous. Sorry, I'm mixing languages. Soul is a creation of intellect. So soul has its intellect, and I think the intellect of soul is not the same as intellect itself.
Shouldn't be, no.
Shouldn't be, no. And so I think I'd like to. I think I'd like to keep them separate. Now, maybe the question you could ask is, supposing we're souls, we're pure souls freed from the body and having a good time in the intelligible realm. Okay, do we have the higher virtues?
Yeah, sort of.
I think so. Yeah, why not?
Yes.
In fact, we have the higher virtues perfectly, completely.
Yeah.
And since we don't have to deal with the body, we don't need the political virtues anymore.
No.
So I mean, I'm speculating again with Plotinus, but I would imagine that there's no reason, I can't see any reason for denying that soul in the intelligible world, whatever that is, soul as an intelligible reality taken in itself, can't have the higher virtues to the extent that soul is something different from nous.
Yes. Yeah.
But if it has the higher virtues and has them perfectly, then there's not much chance of it. Becoming vicious. I don't think that's going to happen.
Mm.
It'll be virtuous entirely and without risk. I think what happens is that when soul comes down to the body, individual souls in particular find themselves in living bodies and then get involved in dealing with the living body. Then you get into trouble.
Yes, things get murky. Yeah. Yeah.
But Plotinus is, you might say, he's quite classical in the sense that he insists that virtue is a disposition of soul, you know, and to say that for him means that it's a disposition that can be lost, and this happens, I think, when soul descends in the body. But this cannot be admitted for nous. I think the Ennead 1-2 is very clear about that.
Yes.
It's not, you know, it's not something that can be added to or lost in nous.
Yeah. I often have to read it over again, but I feel that in 1-2 he's less sort of scholastic, I suppose, than Porphyry in arranging definite levels. At the top there seems to be not paradigmatic virtues, but paradigms of virtue. Now,
yes.
Whatever
Yeah.
difference we can make out of that. But it seems to me that at the higher level of soul, it might be paradigms of virtue that you are engaged in. What that translates out into a nice point.
Yeah.
But it's interesting.
I just think Plotinus would think that the expression paradigmatic virtues is nonsense.
Yeah. It's
Paradigms. And then you have virtues, but not paradigmatic virtues.
I think it's more the scholastic mind of Porphyry that arranged these things.
That's right, yes.
Yeah, two more added by Ambrose.
Yeah.
If I may, Porphyry does use the word paradigmata as well, and he says that these paradigmata are paradigmatic virtues. So perhaps Plotinus could have been more indulgent, but then you would say that the examples belong to soul, to forms of individuals.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, Irene, you don't want to get into forms of individuals, do you?
Perhaps.
Face up to it. Yeah.
Not now, perhaps, but
no.
that's the way I would understand that, and then I would wonder in what way soul is different from intellect. I would say in the sense that it also does another job different than intellect's activity. That is, it looks outwards.
Which are you talking about soul?
About soul, yes, so that it can be different from intellect and yet essentially a form.
Yes. Yes, I don't know. I don't.
Well, I think, yeah.
I think the forms are primarily identical for Plotinus with nous, with the intellects. But then soul is an image of intellect. Yeah.
Well, thank you very much. I think we'd rather avoid discussing forms of individuals like right now.
Yeah.
And let us thank you again,
You're very
Professor
welcome.
O'Meara, Dominic, for this wonderful talk
Thank
and
you.
the wonderful discussion. And thank you all for being here and for contributing to the discussion. Next time, our speaker will be Professor Gerson, who is going to talk on taking Plato seriously, Proclus as exeget. That would be on the 30th of May, but until then, thank you again, Professor
you.
Dominic.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you all.
Again, of course, yeah.
So,
Bye-bye. Bye-bye.
bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you very much.